The chains felt like bars of ice against Clara Emerson's wrists. They were heavy, rusted, and bit deep into her skin with every step the sheriff forced her to take. She was dragged through the mud and slush of the main street, her thin calico dress soaked and freezing to her legs. The wind was a living thing, smelling of pine and the bitter iron of oncoming snow. They shoved her through the bat-wing doors of the Criterion Saloon. This was where justice was served in Laramie Creek, Wyoming territory. Not in a courthouse, but in a long room that stank of stale whiskey, wet wool, and the rank fear of men. The room was packed. Every rancher, every shopkeep, every wife who rarely left her homestead was here. Their faces were a white, blurred wall of judgment. The sheriff, a thick-set man named Harris, shoved her into a wooden chair facing a heavy oak table. On the other side sat the jury, 12 men whose hands were stained with dirt and whose eyes were hard with suspicion. They looked at her like she was a rabid wolf dragged in from the hills. "Clara Emerson," Sheriff Harris's voice boomed, unrolling a piece of paper. "You stand accused, aiding and abetting the flight of the fugitive Caleb Emerson, accessory to the murders of Silas Croft and young Thomas Biddle." A low murmur swept the room, ugly and sharp. Clara kept her eyes down, fixed on the floorboards. Caleb was her brother. He had shown up 2 nights ago, his horse lathered, his eyes wild. He had taken her food, her last $10, and the horse she tended for the livery. He had not told her he had just shot 2 men in a dispute over cards. He had not told her they were the sons of the most powerful rancher in the valley, second only to the man who was now walking into the room. The saloon door swung open, letting in a blast of freezing air. The crowd parted. Morgan Thorne moved through them, and the silence that followed him was heavier than the chains on Clara's wrists. He was not just the judge. He was the territory. He owned the vast stretches of land north of the creek, the timber rights on the mountain, and, by default, the town itself. He was a tall man, built broad in the shoulders, with a face that looked carved from the same granite as the peaks that shadowed the town. He wore a heavy wool coat, brushed free of snow, and moved with a slight, measured limp that spoke of old pain. His eyes, the color of a winter sky before a blizzard, swept the room and settled on her. Clara felt that gaze like a physical weight. He took his place behind the oak table. He did not sit. "The jury has heard the testimony." Thorne's voice was low, rough like gravel, but it filled the room without effort. She gave him a horse. She gave him provisions. She lied to the posse. "She's as guilty as him," shouted a man from the back. "His bullet, her hand." The room exploded. "Hang her! String her up! An eye for an eye!" The sound was a roar, a single beast hungry for a life. The town was afraid. Caleb Emerson was still out there, a symptom of the lawlessness that crept in with the winter. And they needed to punish someone. They needed to feel safe. The jury foreman, a baker named Hobbs, stood up, his face pale. "Judge Thorne, we find her guilty. The sentence is death by hanging." Clara's breath seized in her chest. She squeezed her eyes shut. She had expected it, but the finality of the words was a cold stone in her stomach. She would die here, in the dirt, for the sins of her brother. Morgan Thorne held up one hand. The room fell instantly silent again, waiting. He looked at Clara, and for a fleeting second, his expression was unreadable. It was not anger, it was something colder, more calculating. "The jury demands death," he said, his voice flat. "The law demands it. The town is right to be afraid." He paused, letting the silence stretch until it was thin and screaming. "However," he continued, "the territory grants its judiciary latitude, especially in the case of a woman." A few people muttered they wanted blood, not latitude. "She will not hang." A collective gasp. Clara's head snapped up, her heart pounding with a sudden, sick hope. The foreman looked confused. But Judge, the law— I am the law here, Mr. Hobbs, Thorne said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was more threatening than any shout. He turned his full attention back to Clara. The room seemed to shrink, leaving only the two of them. You are guilty, Clara Emerson. You have forfeited your life to this town, but I am offering an alternative to the rope. He let the word hang in the air. Clara watched him, her hands trembling in their iron bonds. My homestead is isolated. It is a long ride from here. Since the death of my wife, it has been without a woman's hand. The implications began to dawn on the crowd. A nervous, sick titter came from one of the women in the back. Clara felt her blood run cold again, but for a different reason. You will be remanded to my custody, Thorne declared. His face was a mask of cold justice. For 1 month, you will live in my home. You will perform the duties of a wife. You will cook, you will clean, you will tend my home. You will not leave. You will not refuse. The room was utterly, profoundly shocked. This was not justice. This was ownership. A woman cried out, Morgan, that's a sin. Thorne's head snapped toward the voice. It is a punishment. It is humiliation. She aided a murderer. She will be stripped of her name, her freedom, and her pride. She will be my property. And it will serve as a warning to any other woman in this town who thinks to put family blood before the law. He looked back at Clara. Her hope had curdled into a black, burning rage. He was offering her life, but demanding her soul. It was a sentence meant to break her in ways the gallows never could. That is the choice, he said, the rope, or my terms. Clara stared at his impassive face. The shame was so thick she could taste it, like ash in her mouth. She saw the leering faces of the men in the crowd. The disgusted pity from the women. She was trapped. Her voice was a dry rasp, barely audible. I agree. A heavy sigh of anticlimax and dark excitement filled the saloon. The show was over, and a new, stranger one was about to begin. Sheriff, Thorne said, turning away from her as if the transaction was complete. Release her to me. You want the chains off, Judge? No, Thorne said, walking toward the door. She leaves as she is, a prisoner. Sheriff Harris roughly unlocked the chain binding her to the chair, but left the heavy manacles on her wrists. He yanked her to her feet. The walk back through the saloon was worse. The eyes were different now. They were not judging a criminal. They were assessing property. They were imagining her in the judge's home, in his bed. She was shoved out into the biting wind. Thorne was already mounted on a large, dark gelding. He waited, impassive. As Harris lifted Clara, she was too numb and stiff to fight. He didn't put her on the horse. Instead, he took the length of chain connecting her wrists and shackled it directly to the thick leather of his saddle horn. He was going to lead her like livestock. A few onlookers who had followed them out gasped. One man laughed. Someone spat, the glob landing on the hem of her skirt. Clara flinched, her face burning with a shame so hot it eclipsed the cold. Thorne didn't look at her. He simply nudged his horse forward, and the chain yanked her with him. She stumbled, catching her footing just before she fell, and was forced into a half-trot, half-walk to keep up. They left Laramie Creek behind. The last sounds she heard were the shouts of children and the ugly laughter of men. Then, there was only the sound of the horse's hooves crunching in the deepening snow and the metallic, rhythmic jingle of her own chains. The ride was a special kind of hell. The cold was a physical blade, slipping through her thin dress and settling deep in her bones. The sun was a pale smear in the gray sky, offering no warmth. Morgan Thorne never looked back. He sat tall in the saddle, a rigid silhouette against the vast, white landscape. He led her through a world of harsh, staggering beauty. They followed the frozen line of a creek, its water locked solid beneath a sheet of milky ice. They moved through stands of tall pines, their branches heavy with snow, casting long, blue shadows across the trail. The land opened up into vast snowfields, unbroken and blinding white, stretching to the feet of the jagged, dark mountains that ringed the valley. Clara was silent. Her fury was the only thing keeping her warm. It was a hard, tight knot in her chest. She hated him. She hated his broad, unmoving back. She hated his silence. She hated the precise, economical way he moved, as if he, too, were frozen. She hated her brother for his weakness, and the town for its cruelty, and herself for her weakness in choosing this. Her feet were numb stones. Her hands, chained to the saddle, were raw and purple. She stumbled more than once, the chain yanking her wrist so hard she cried out. He stopped the horse each time, waited without a word for her to regain her footing, and then moved on. He offered no help. He offered no words. The sun began to bleed into the horizon, staining the snowfields pink and orange. The cold deepened, becoming truly dangerous. Clara was shivering so violently her teeth ached. She did not know how much longer she could stand. Just as she felt she would finally collapse and let the snow take her, he turned the horse off the main trail and up a shallow rise. Through the thickening dusk, she saw it. It was not a homestead. It was a scar. The cabin was perched on the edge of a ridge, overlooking the valley. It was a lonely, dark shape against the snow, made of dark, heavy-hewn logs. One side of the roof looked newer than the other, and a section of the wall beside the stone chimney was blackened, the wood showing the faint, dark memory of a fire. It was a house that had seen loss. Thorne dismounted, his bad leg causing him to favor his right side as he landed in the snow. He walked to her, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. He produced a key and, with stiff fingers, unlocked the heavy manacle from his saddle. He did not unlock the cuffs on her wrists. He merely grabbed the connecting chain and tugged. Inside. She stumbled after him, her legs wooden. He pushed the heavy door open. The inside was one large room, with a dark, low loft overhead. It was brutally cold. The air inside as frigid as the air outside. The fire was dead stone. A rough-sawn table and 2 chairs sat in the middle of the room, a dry sink, a cast-iron stove, and against the far wall, a large wooden bed frame, piled with quilts. It was a man's room, spare and functional, but there were traces of something else. On the mantelpiece, a small, carved wooden bird sat next to a stack of books. A faded patched quilt was folded over the back of one chair. This was not just a bachelor's cabin. This was a place where things had died. Morgan Thorne dropped the end of her chain onto the table. He moved to the fireplace, striking a match. The dry kindling caught, and a small, hungry flame began to lick at the larger logs. He did not take his coat off. He turned to her. The new firelight cast flickering, monstrous shadows across his face. "You are here for 1 month," he stated, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Your sentence has begun." He walked to the dry sink and picked up a bucket. He shoved it into her hands. Her chained wrists made it clumsy. "The stream is behind the cabin. Through those trees. You will fetch the water. Then you will heat it on the stove." Clara stared at him, bewildered. "Heat it for what?" "For my bath." He sat down heavily in one of the chairs. Unbuttoning his coat, he gestured to the stove. "You will cook. The pantry is there. You will clean. The floor is filthy." He stuck his right leg out, resting his heel on the floor. "This leg requires tending. The poultice is in the tin on the shelf. You will heat it and apply it." Clara's stomach twisted. She looked from the empty stove to the dark door, to the man watching her. "And at night," he said, his voice dropping, "you will not be chained." A small, terrified spark ignited in her. He pointed to the single bed. "You will sleep there." "With you?" she whispered, the words choking her. "You are here to serve the duties of a wife," he said, his eyes flat and cold. "That is the bed. There is no other, You will do as you are told, or you will be returned to Laramie Creek. The gallows will still be waiting." He stood and moved to the corner, beginning to unbuckle his heavy gun belt. He did not look at her again. He was dismissing her. The first night was a torment of cold and tension. She did as she was told, her movements stiff with rage and humiliation. She fetched the water, her chained hands sloshing half of it onto the floor. She lit the stove. She found the pantry, meager stores of flour, beans, and salted pork. She tended his leg, her fingers trembling as she unwrapped the bandage from the old, scarred wound beneath. It was a bullet wound, puckered and angry, that had never healed right. He watched her do it, his jaw tight, but he never spoke. She did not heat the bath water. She could not. He did not press the issue, seeming to forget it as he stared into the fire. When the time came, he simply nodded at the bed. He had removed his boots, his gun belt, and his heavy coat. He lay on top of the quilts, fully dressed, and turned his back to her. Clara, still in her damp, freezing dress, hesitated for a long, agonizing minute. The cabin was a small box. There was nowhere to run. She walked to the bed and lay on the absolute farthest edge, her back to him, pulling a single, thin quilt over her shoulder. It smelled faintly of wood smoke and soap. The silence was deafening. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind outside. He did not move. He did not touch her. He did not speak. He just lay there, a mountain of silence beside her. Clara shivered. She shivered from the cold that seemed to radiate from the walls, from the floor, from the man beside her. She shivered from fear, but mostly, she shivered from a rage so profound it felt like it would crack her ribs. She lay there, listening to him breathe, staring into the darkness of the cabin. She would not let this man break her. She would fetch his water. She would cook his food. She would even sleep in his bed. But she would not be broken. She would watch. She would wait. And when the chance came, she would escape. She would walk into the frozen wilderness and freeze to death before she would let him win. Morgan Thorne was not asleep. He stared at the rough-hewn logs of the ceiling, his body rigid. He could hear her shivering. He could feel the small, frantic vibrations of it through the mattress. He could smell the damp wool and the faint, clean scent of her hair. He closed his eyes, but all he saw were other eyes the same color of blue, but milky with sickness. He heard a different, weaker breathing in the silence. Elspeth, his wife. He had buried her and his daughter in the frozen earth just 50 yards from this cabin, during a blizzard just like this one. Having this girl here, in this bed, was not justice. It was a desecration. It was a constant, waking nightmare. He had done it to save her life, but he had not realized it would mean the end of his own peace. He turned his head slightly, watching the moonlight fall on her tangled hair. The guarded pain in his chest tightened. He saw his wife's eyes, and he hated himself for it. The tension in the small, dark cabin was a physical thing, a third presence. It built in the still, cold silence of the snowy wilderness, a fragile truce between two broken people, waiting for the dawn. The second day began with the smell of sizzling fat. Clara, clumsy with her chained wrists, was frying salt pork in a heavy iron skillet. She reached across the stove for the coffee, her sleeve catching the handle. The skillet tipped, hot grease, popping and hissing, splashed over the back of her right hand. She cried out, a sharp intake of breath, and snatched her hand back, dropping the fork. The pain was immediate, a white-hot sheet that wrapped around her fingers and wrist. She clenched her teeth, staring at the skin as it instantly puckered and reddened. Morgan was at the table, cleaning his revolver. He was on his feet before she had fully registered the accident. He moved with that same surprising speed she'd seen in the saloon. "Let me see it," he commanded, his voice low. "It's nothing," Clara snapped, cradling her hand to her chest. She turned her back to him, reaching for the water bucket with her good hand. intending to plunge the burn into the icy water. He did not ask again. He grabbed her shoulder and spun her around. His grip was not gentle. He seized her burned wrist, forcing her fingers open. The chains rattled. Clara winced, fighting the instinct to yank away from him. He examined the wound, his dark eyes scanning the angry red skin. Blisters were already rising. His jaw was set, but his expression was not one of anger. It was focused. "It will fester if not tended," he said, his voice flat. He tugged her toward the water bucket, his grip like an iron band. He plunged her hand into the freezing water himself. Clara gasped at the shock of the cold, but it numbed the fire. He held her there for a long minute, his other hand firmly on her forearm, pinning her in place. She refused to look at him. She stared at the floor, her body rigid with humiliation. He was touching her, treating her like a disobedient child or a piece of livestock. When he finally drew her hand out, he kept his grip. He sat her down hard in the chair by the fire. He went to a small shelf, taking down a tin of dark, pungent salve and a roll of clean linen. He knelt in front of her. Clara tried to pull her hand back. "I can do it." "Be still," he ordered. He opened the tin. His touch, when it came, was the opposite of his grip. His large, calloused fingers, stained with dirt and gunpowder, were surprisingly gentle. He spread the greasy salve over the burn, his movements measured and careful. Clara watched, mesmerized against her will. He was rough in all things, yet this one action was tender. He did not seem to realize the contradiction. He worked in silence, his brow furrowed. He wrapped the linen around her hand and wrist, binding it tightly. Securing the bandage with a practiced knot, he finished and released her, standing up. The moment of stillness was broken. He was the judge again. "Be more careful," he said, and turned back to his table. Clara stared at her bandaged hand. She felt a confusing swirl of emotions, rage at his dominance, shame at her helplessness, and a small, traitorous flicker of something else, something that felt like gratitude, which only made her angrier. The days that followed fell into a brutal, monotonous rhythm. They were long, bitter, and defined by silence. The cold was a constant presence, seeping through the log walls. Clara worked from the moment the sun rose, a pale light in the gray sky, until she collapsed into the bed, her body aching. She scrubbed his floors with lye soap and a stiff brush, her knees raw, her bandaged hand throbbing. She fetched water, the bucket agonizingly heavy with her chained wrists. She learned to chop wood, the axe clumsy and dangerous. She split her knuckles more than once, the blood freezing instantly on her skin. She patched his torn shirts, her stitches small and neat, a skill from another life. She cooked his meals, gritty coffee, tough salt pork, and endless pots of beans. He never thanked her. He would watch her sometimes, his face an impassive mask. He ate what she made without comment. He accepted her work as his due. He was the master of this small, frozen kingdom, and she was his subject, his property. The nights were the worst, lying beside him in the dark, separated by a chasm of silence and resentment, but forced into the intimacy of the shared bed. He never touched her. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, or turned away from her, a rigid line of rejection. She lay on her side, facing the wall, her body tense, waiting for a movement that never came. She learned the sound of his breathing, the slight hitch when his bad leg pained him. The routine was broken by the storm. It had been brewing for 2 days. The sky a low, bruised purple. It hit in the middle of the night, a physical assault on the small cabin. The wind did not howl. It screamed. It sounded like a choir of grieving women, a high-pitched, relentless shriek that seemed to come from inside her own skull. Snow and ice pelted the roof like thrown gravel. Clara was awake, her heart pounding. The cabin felt fragile, a tiny wooden box in a world of violence. Morgan was awake, too, Neither of them spoke. He got up and added more logs to the fire, the orange light filling the room with leaping, frantic shadows. Clara sat up, pulling the quilt around her shoulders. And then it came. A flash of light so bright it bleached the room, turning everything stark white and black for a split second. It was followed instantaneously by a crack that sounded as if the sky had been torn in two. It was not thunder. It was a strike. Close. The cabin shuddered, and the sharp, terrifying scent of ozone and burning pine filled the air. A tall pine just yards from the window had exploded, its branches now flickering with flame. Clara did not just flinch. She screamed. It was not a sound of fear. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. She scrambled backward off the bed, her feet tangling in the quilts, landing hard on the cold floor. "No," she gasped, her hands flying to her head. "No, please, not again. The smoke. I can't." She wasn't in the cabin. She was somewhere else, somewhere dark and hot. She was small, and the world was ending. Morgan was across the room in 2 strides. He saw her, huddled against the wall, her eyes wide and unseeing, her body trembling violently. This was not a simple fear of storms. "Clara," he said, his voice sharp. She didn't hear him. She was choking, gasping for air that wasn't there. "It's burning! Let me out! Mama!" He grabbed her. He hauled her to her feet, his hands digging into her upper arms. She fought him, her small fists beating uselessly against his chest, her movements animalistic and blind. "Let me go! It's burning!" "Clara!" he roared, his voice cutting through her panic. He pinned her arms to her sides and pulled her tight against his chest, locking her in a hold she could not break. His body was a wall, solid and unmoving. He put one large hand on the back of her head, forcing her face into the rough wool of his shirt. "It is the storm," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "Just lightning. The tree is outside. You are safe." She continued to struggle, her breath coming in ragged, tearing sobs. "You are in the cabin," he repeated, his voice firm, unwavering. "You are not in the fire. Breathe. Just breathe." He held her. He did not soften his grip, but he did not move. He was a solid, living anchor in her world of terror. She inhaled the scent of him, wood smoke, soap, and the faint, metallic smell of his gun oil. Slowly, the terror receded, leaving behind a bone-deep shaking. The screams quieted into desperate, hiccuping sobs. She was crying. She, who had not cried when she was sentenced, when the town spat on her, when he chained her to his horse. She was crying now, against the chest of her captor. She finally went limp, her forehead resting against his collarbone. He held her for another long minute, the only sounds the dying wind and her own ragged breathing. Then she realized what she was doing. She was clinging to him. Shame washed over her, cold and sharp. She pushed away from him, stumbling back. Her face was wet, her hair wild. I'm sorry," she whispered, wiping her face with her sleeve. Morgan stared at her, his expression unreadable in the dim firelight. He looked from her to the still flickering tree outside. He gave a single, curt nod. "It was a childhood fire," she said, her voice small, needing to explain. I lost my mother." He didn't offer pity. He simply turned back to the hearth and stoked the fire, his movements measured. "Go back to sleep. The storm is passing." But the silence was broken. The next day, the air in the cabin was different. It was thick with the things they had seen. They began to talk. Slowly, the words were hesitant, dropped into the silence like stones into a deep well. He was sitting at the table, sharpening his knife. She was kneading dough, her bandaged hand aching. "Your brother," he said, not looking up. "Caleb." Clara's hand stilled in the dough. "What about him?" "Why did you help him?" It was the same question he had asked himself in the saloon, but it felt different here. "He's my brother," she said, her voice low. "He showed up. He was desperate. He's not what you think." Morgan tested the blade with his thumb. "He murdered 2 men, Silas Croft and his boy. The boy was 17. Caleb wouldn't just— He's not a killer," she insisted, her voice rising. "He must have been provoked. Those men, the Crofts, they were gamblers. They were cruel." "Does that make their lives forfeit?" Morgan asked, his voice still quiet. "He's my blood," she cried, turning to face him. "He's all I have left. I didn't know what he had done. Not until the posse came. I just knew he was running. What would you have me do? Turn him in to be hanged?" Morgan looked up, his eyes meeting hers. They were cold as the frozen streams. "Yes." The word was final. Clara turned back to her dough, punching it with unnecessary force. "You don't understand family." "I understand the law," he said. He looked down at his knife, but she saw the muscle in his jaw tighten, a hard knot of unresolved anger. He understood justice, and in his mind, she was on the wrong side of it. A few days later, a brief thaw melted the top layer of snow. Clara, desperate for a breath of air that didn't taste of smoke and confinement, was shaking out the bed's quilts on the small porch. The air was sharp, clean, and biting. She glanced toward the tree line. Where the snow was thinnest, she saw him. Morgan was standing near a small copse of aspen, his back to the cabin. He had his hat in his hands. He was looking down at the ground. At first, she thought he was just watching the trail, but he didn't move. He was utterly still. She saw what he was looking at. 2 mounds of rock piled neatly. They were graves. One was the length of a person. The other was heartbreakingly small. At the head of each was a simple cross, made of 2 sticks lashed together with twine. Clara's breath caught. His wife and child died during childbirth in a blizzard. The town gossip came back to her. He had buried them here, alone, on this desolate ridge. He knelt, his bad legs stiff, and straightened the smaller cross, which had tilted in the wind. He brushed snow from the stones. He stayed there for a long time, a dark, solitary figure defined by his grief. Clara retreated inside. The quilt clutched in her hands. The cabin felt different. It was not just his home. It was his tomb. The man who sat across from her, the man who had bound her hand and held her during the storm, was a man hollowed out by loss. It didn't excuse his cruelty, but it explained it. The tension in the cabin deepened. It was no longer just the tension of captor and prisoner. It was the tension of 2 wounded people forced into the same small space. She saw his vulnerability again. She was woken in the dead of night by a sound, a sharp, choked gasp. She sat up. Morgan was sitting bolt upright in the bed, his hands clenched in the quilt. The moonlight streamed through the window, painting him in shades of gray. He was drenched in sweat, his shirt plastered to his chest, though the cabin was freezing. "Elspeth," he breathed, the name a raw wound. "God, no! The smoke! The smoke!" He was dreaming, caught in his own nightmare. It was not the fire that took his wife, Clara realized, but perhaps one that he had failed to stop. Or maybe it was just the memory of the cold, of the fire in the hearth being the only warmth while his wife and child grew cold. "Morgan," she whispered. He didn't hear her. He swung his legs off the bed, his head in his hands, his breathing ragged. He was shaking, not with cold, but with a deep, internal tremor. The Iron Judge, the man who held the power of life and death, was terrified of his own memories. Clara sat, pulling her knees to her chest, watching him. She was shaken. He was not a monster. He was just a man, a broken, haunted man. He eventually stood, walked to the fire, and sat in the chair, staring into the embers. He did not come back to bed before the sun rose. A week later, the roles were reversed. Clara woke up shivering, but the cabin was not cold. A fire burned brightly. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness sent the room spinning. She fell back, a groan escaping her. She was burning with fever. The next 3 days were a blur. She was lost in a fog of heat and shivering, of vivid, terrifying dreams and brief, confusing moments of clarity. Through it all, there was a constant presence. Morgan. He was not the judge. He was not her captor. He was just there. She remembered the feel of a cool, damp cloth on her forehead, on her neck. It was heaven. She remembered the taste of water, and later, thin, salty broth being spooned past her chapped lips. She remembered being lifted, her light weight nothing to him, as he changed the sweat-soaked linens on the bed. He tended her with a grim, almost obsessive focus. He did not speak. He just worked. On what she thought was the third night, she drifted up from the fog. The cabin was dark. The fire burned low. She was hot, but the terrible shivering had stopped. She felt weak, boneless, but her mind was clear. She realized her head was not on the pillow. It was in his lap. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, leaning against the headboard, and he had her cradled against him. He was wiping her face with a damp cloth. He was speaking, his voice a low, aching murmur, a sound she had never heard from him. "It's all right, my love," he whispered, his thumb brushing her temple. "The fever is breaking. You're safe. Just hold on, Elspeth. I won't lose you. I won't lose you again, I swear it." Clara's eyes were open, but she didn't move. Elspeth. He thought she was his dead wife. The realization was a shard of ice in her gut. She was a replacement, a phantom. He wasn't caring for her. Clara, he was caring for a ghost. The gentleness, the tenderness. It wasn't for her. She closed her eyes, a single, hot tear slipping from the corner of her eye, and let the darkness take her back. When she woke properly, it was morning. She was alone in the bed. The sheets were clean. She was weak, but the fever was gone. Morgan was at the table, cleaning his rifle, the same as he had been the day of her accident. "You are awake," he stated. It was not a question.
"Yes,"
she whispered. Her throat was raw. "There is broth on the stove," he said, his voice flat. He did not look at her. He was the judge again. Clara tried to pull the walls back up. She tried to hate him, but it was impossible. The fever had broken more than just her health. It had broken the last of the boundaries between them. He had seen her at her absolute weakest. She had seen him at his most vulnerable. They began to share meals at the table. He no longer motioned for her to sit. It was just expected. They ate in silence, but it was no longer the silence of a prisoner and a guard. It was the charged, heavy silence of two people who knew too much, who had seen too much. One evening, a week later, she was standing by the fire, her strength fully returned. She was just watching the flames. He finished tending his leg and stood up. He walked to the hearth, standing beside her, warming his hands. They stood side by side, two solitary figures lit by the fire. The air between them was thick, vibrating with all the unsaid things. His nightmares, her panic, his dead wife, her fever. He turned his head and looked at her. His gaze traveled over her face, her hair, her neck. It was not a look of judgment. It was a look of starvation, a deep, profound loneliness that she recognized in her own chest. She felt a strange pull, a current in the small space between them. She turned to face him. His eyes were dark, searching hers. He was looking for something. Permission, forgiveness. She didn't know. He lifted his hand, the one that had bound her wound, the one that had wiped her brow. He moved slowly, as if afraid she would bolt. He touched her hair, his rough fingers brushing a strand back from her cheek. His touch lingered. He leaned in. It was not a sudden move. It was agonizingly slow, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. She was frozen. her heart pounding a heavy, slow beat against her ribs. His lips met hers. It was not a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of profound, aching need. It was hesitant. Chapped lips against chapped lips. It was the taste of wood smoke and coffee and the salt of his skin. It was a kiss of shared grief, of two broken people reaching for the only other living soul in their frozen world. For a split second, it deepened. A flicker of heat, a desperate craving. And then Clara's mind caught up with her body. She was kissing him. Morgan Thorne, her jailer, the man who had sentenced her, the man who called her by his dead wife's name. Shame, hot and violent, flooded her. Her body had betrayed her. Her own desire had betrayed her. She ripped her mouth from his. With a strangled cry, she slapped him. Her palm connected with his jaw with a sharp, ugly crack that echoed in the small cabin. His head snapped to the side from the force of it. Clara stood, breathing hard, her hands stinging, her lips burning. She was shaking, horrified at what he had done, but more horrified that, for 1 second, she had wanted it. Morgan turned his head back slowly. His face was not angry, it was stunned. And beneath the surprise, a deep, profound sadness settled in his eyes. He looked at her trembling form, at her tear-filled, furious eyes. He said nothing. He turned, grabbed his heavy coat from the peg by the door, and walked out into the black, freezing night. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving Clara alone, shaking, in the sudden, terrible silence. She slid to the floor, her back against the warm stones of the hearth, and buried her face in her hands. He did not return to the cabin until just before dawn. Clara heard him, the crunch of his boots in the snow, the soft stamp as he cleared them on the porch. He did not come back to bed. She heard the scrape of the chair, the soft pop of a log being added to the embers. When she rose, the sky a bruised gray. He was already gone, his rifle with him. The next 3 days were a new kind of prison. The small cabin, which had become a place of shared, forced intimacy, was now a cavern of avoidance. The silence was louder than any argument. It was thick with the memory of the kiss, the sting of the slap, and the raw, unheard confessions of their shared nightmares. Clara kept to herself, her movements small and deliberate. She scrubbed, she cooked, she mended. She poured her shame and confusion into the work. She had slapped him, but worse, she had wanted him. She had seen the loneliness in his eyes, and it had called to a matching emptiness in her. She scrubbed the floors as if she could wipe the memory from the very boards. Morgan was a ghost. He left before she woke and returned long after dark, eating the plate of beans and salt pork she left for him by the fire, his face grim and shadowed. He slept on the floor, rolling himself in a spare blanket near the hearth, his back to the bed. He never spoke. She watched him from the window. A small, selfish part of her relieved he was gone. He rode out each morning, his rifle resting in the crook of his arm. He rode the ridgeline, a dark speck against the snow, patrolling. She assumed he was checking trap lines or hunting. She did not know he was searching for tracks, for any sign of her brother. He was hunting the man who was the cause of her being there. His mind a cold, tangled knot of duty and a new, unwelcome possessiveness. On the 4th day, the silence and the confinement became too much. A restless, churning energy filled Clara. He was gone. The cabin was clean. The bread was baked. She was trapped. She began to clean with a feverish intensity, not out of duty, but out of a need to do something. She wiped down the mantel, her fingers tracing the small, carved bird. She swept the corners. She knelt by his small, crude bookshelf, intending to dust the few leather-bound volumes. Behind them, tucked into the dark space where the logs met, was a wooden box. It was not large, made of dark cherry wood, with a simple brass latch. It was not locked. Her hand trembled. This was his. It was private. It was not part of her sentence to pry into his past. She should close it, push it back, and forget she had ever seen it. She opened it. Inside, there was a ribbon tied around a lock of pale, baby-fine hair. There was a dried flower, pressed flat and brittle, and underneath there were journals. 2 of them. One was a thick, sturdy ledger. The other was a smaller, softer leather book, its cover warped as if it had been wet. She opened the small one first. The handwriting was feminine, delicate and looping. It was a diary. Elspeth. Clara's stomach clenched. She read the first page, her face hot. May 3rd, 1871. Morgan brought me to the homestead. It is wild, but it is beautiful. He is so strong. I fear he sees this land as something to be tamed, while I only wish to be part of it. Clara snapped the book shut. She felt like a grave robber. This was not for her. She picked up the ledger. His handwriting. It was the same bold, severe script she had seen on her own sentencing papers. She opened it. The first entries were about the ranch. November 10th. Fix the northern fence line. Snow will be deep this year. Elspeth is well. Clara's fingers traced the ink. She skipped ahead. The entries were terse, factual. December 1st. Blizzard came in hard. Wind from the north. Drifts are shoulder high. December 2nd. Elspeth's time is near. The wind is too high. I cannot make it to town for the doctor. She says it is fine. Clara's heart began to pound. A slow, heavy drum. December 3rd. The fire is burning. She is in pain. I told her. She is strong. The baby is coming. The next entry was written in a hand that was barely recognizable. The ink was splotched, the letters deep and angry, tearing the paper. She is gone. The baby. A girl. She never breathed. The smoke. The cabin was filled with smoke. The chimney stack. The downdraft from the storm. It was too cold to open the door. The smoke. I couldn't get the smoke out. She was so weak. She just stopped. I held her hand. It was so cold. I sat with them for 2 days. The blizzard stopped. I buried them. I buried Elspeth and my daughter, who never had a name. I buried them on the ridge. The ground was frozen. It took all day. Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She could feel the cold of that day. She could feel the splintering of the shovel against the frozen earth. He had woken from his nightmares yelling about smoke. It wasn't a fire. It was the smoke from his own hearth, choking the life from his wife while the storm trapped him. She read on. The entries became sparse. January. The wolf is back. Killed it. It is not enough. February. Rode to town. They spoke to me. Fools. Their words are air. March. The ground is still frozen. I am still here. And then the last entry, written nearly a year before Clara had arrived. There is no justice. There is only the storm. There is the cold. And there is the ground. The law is a lie we tell ourselves to feel warm. There is no warmth. I am the law now, and I am as cold as the ground. Clara closed the ledger. Her hands were shaking. She put the box back, exactly as she had found it. She stood up, feeling dizzy. He was not a monster. He was not a cruel, ironclad judge. He was a man who had been buried alive. He was a man who had sat with his dead wife and child for 2 days, trapped by the same snow that now surrounded her. His bitterness was not a choice. It was a tomb he had built around himself, a frozen shell to protect the raw, screaming wound inside. And she had slapped him for wanting to feel something, for wanting to touch one single living thing. That night, he came in late as usual. He was covered in snow, his face gray with exhaustion and cold. He sat by the fire, pulling off his frozen gloves, his back to her. He had not eaten. Clara moved before she could think. She ladled hot stew, not beans, into a bowl. She had made it with the last of the root vegetables. She brought it to him. He looked at the bowl, then at her. His eyes were guarded, expecting a trick. "You should eat," she said, her voice quiet. He took the bowl. She did not retreat to the bed. She sat in the other chair, across the hearth from him. They sat in silence, but the silence was different. It was no longer the silence of avoidance. It was the silence of the ledger. He finished the stew, his gaze fixed on the flames. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked up, his eyes sharp. "Why what? Why this sentence? For me?" She had to know. "It was cruel. To bring me here. To your home." Morgan stared into the fire. He was silent for so long she thought he would not answer. "The town," he said, his voice a low rasp. "They wanted a hanging. Harris, the jury, they were afraid. They wanted to make an example of you." "And you did," she said, bitterness creeping in. "You made me your property." "I made you alive," he snapped, his head coming up. His eyes flashed, not with coldness, but with a sudden, hot anger. "Do you think I wanted you here? In her house? Sleeping in her bed?" He gestured wildly at the room, at the ghosts only he could see. "I did the only thing I could. The law has loopholes for humiliation. It has no loopholes for a rope." He had saved her. He had chosen a sentence that seemed cruel to the town, a sentence that shamed her, but one that kept her heart beating. Clara looked at her hands. "Survival?" she murmured. "It costs so much." He looked at her, his anger fading, replaced by a weary understanding. "It costs everything." I know," she said, and the words were out before she could stop them. "I know what it costs. I once begged for a man's life." He stilled. He turned his full attention to her. "What man?" "It doesn't matter. He was young. He stole a side of beef to feed his family. They were going to hang him. The rancher. He was a powerful man. I went to him. I begged." Clara's voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "Remembering. I was young. I thought I had something he might want, something to trade." Morgan's face was carved from stone. "What did you trade?" "My pride, my body. I offered him everything I had to let this man go." "And did he?" Clara laughed, a short, ugly sound. "No, he took what I offered, and he hanged the man anyway. He said it was important to follow the law." She met Morgan's gaze, her own eyes as cold as his had ever been. "I learned that day. Begging costs the beggar. It never saves the damned." The air in the cabin crackled. He was seeing her for the first time. Not as a prisoner, not as a shadow of his wife, but as a survivor, as someone who had walked through her own frozen hell and come out the other side, just as scarred as he was. He stood up. He walked to her, his limp more pronounced. He stood over her chair, blocking the light from the fire. He was a mountain of shadow. "You are wrong," he whispered. His voice was rough, thick with an emotion she could not name. He reached down, his hand cupping her jaw, his thumb brushing her cheek. She did not flinch. He leaned in. "Clara," he said, and the sound of her own name on his lips was a shock. He had never used it. He kissed her. This was not the hesitant, yearning kiss of before. This was a collision. It was rough, desperate, and filled with all the fury of his grief and all the bitterness of her past. It was the kiss of two people who understood the cold. She resisted, her hands flying up to his chest, pushing him. "Morgan, no, this is wrong." "Is it?" he whispered against her mouth, his other hand tangling in her hair, holding her fast. "What is right? The gallows? The cold ground? This is all that's left." His mouth was on hers again, and it was not a question. It was a statement, a claim. He tasted of stew and desperation, and she, who had been so cold for so long, felt something inside her break. Her hands, which had been pushing him away, fisted in the rough wool of his shirt. She was not begging. She was taking. She pulled him down, her own desperation matching his. She pulled him toward the bed, toward the warmth, toward life. It was a fall. They fell together. It was not love. It was something far more primal. It was a night of intense, physical passion that was equal parts punishment and comfort. It was the craving of two starved souls. He was rough, his hands memorizing her as if she were a map out of his loneliness. She was equally fierce, her nails scraping his back, claiming him, purging her own ghosts. They were two people drowning, clinging to each other as the only solid thing in a world of ice. It was a clash of bodies and wills, a desperate affirmation that they were still alive, that they could still feel something, even if it was just pain and heat. When it was over, they lay in the tangled sheets, their breath ragged, the fire burning low. The cabin was utterly silent. There were tears on both sides, not of sadness, but of release, of a terrible, shattering recognition. Everything had changed. The next morning was sharp with a new, blinding tension. The sun streamed in, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The room was the same, but they were not. Clara woke first, tangled in his arms, his heavy breathing warm against her ear. She extricated herself slowly, her body aching, her skin hypersensitive. He was awake when she turned from the stove, a pot of coffee in her hand. He sat on the edge of the bed, his face in his hands, the picture of a man undone. Clara's hand, the one she had burned, throbbed. He needed to shave. His jaw was covered in a dark, rough stubble. She saw him look at his straight razor on the shelf, then at his own hands, which were visibly trembling. She said nothing. She poured hot water from the kettle into the shaving bowl. She took the brush and the small cake of lye soap. She worked up a lather, the sound of the bristles soft in the quiet room. He watched her, his eyes dark and unreadable. She motioned with her chin to the chair. "Sit." He obeyed. He sat, vulnerable, his throat exposed. She approached him, not as a prisoner, not as a lover, but as something else. She applied the lather to his face, her touch careful, impersonal. He closed his eyes. She took the razor. She pulled the skin taut on his cheek, her hand steady. She began to shave him. The scrape of the blade, the only sound. It was the most intimate act she had ever performed. She held a blade to his throat, and he trusted her. She held his life in her hand. When she was finished, she wiped his face clean with a damp cloth. He opened his eyes. He reached up, not to his face. He caught her hand, the bandaged one. He unwrapped the linen, which she had not changed. The burn was healing, a puckered, angry red scar against her pale skin. He lifted her hand to his lips, his own, newly shaven. He didn't kiss it, he just held it there, his warm breath ghosting over the scar. Then he turned her hand over and, with his thumb, wordlessly caressed the scar. A look passed between them. It was an apology. It was an acknowledgement. It was a promise of nothing, and an acceptance of everything. The sound of horses shattered the moment. Both of them stiffened. Morgan was on his feet in an instant, grabbing his rifle from the wall. He moved to the door, pulling it open a crack. Clara's heart hammered. Was it Caleb? 3 riders, Sheriff Harris and 2 deputies. They looked grim, their horses blowing steam in the cold morning air. Morgan stepped onto the porch, his rifle held loosely, but ready. "Harris." "Judge." The sheriff nodded, his eyes flicking past Morgan to where Clara stood in the doorway, her hair undone. He quickly looked away, his face reddening. We have news. Judge, for the girl." Clara stepped out onto the porch, pulling her shawl tighter. The cold hit her instantly. "For me?" Harris took off his hat, twisting the brim in his hands. He wouldn't meet her eyes. "It's about your brother, ma'am, Caleb." "What about him?" Clara's voice was sharp. "He was caught. Over in Cheyenne." Him and his partner tried to rob the First National Bank. Harris looked down at his boots. It didn't go well. Ma'am, a marshal was there. Caleb. He was shot. He's dead. Clara. I'm sorry. Dead. The word was a stone. It dropped into the well of her silence and vanished. Dead. Her brother. The wild, reckless boy who taught her to ride. The man whose sin had cost her her freedom. He was gone. The first feeling was not grief. It was a dizzying, sickening lurch of relief. It was over. The running was over. The fear of him being caught, of him being hanged, it was all over. He was free. And so was she. And then the grief came, hot and sharp, a claw in her throat. He was her blood. He was the last piece of her old life. And he was gone. The relief and the grief crashed into each other. A wave so powerful it stole her breath. Her knees gave out. She didn't hit the porch. Morgan was there. He had moved without her seeing. He dropped the rifle. His arms were around her, pulling her back against his solid chest. He shielded her from the staring eyes of the deputies, turning her face into his shirt. She broke. She didn't just cry, she sobbed. A raw, animal wail that came from the deepest part of her. It was a sound of loss, of guilt, of a terrible, unholy freedom. She pounded her fists against his chest, but he held her fast. He didn't pat her back. He didn't murmur empty comforts. He just held her. He wrapped her in his strength, a living wall against the world, and let her grieve. He looked over her head, his eyes glacial. Meeting the sheriffs. The look was a command. Leave. Harris, deeply uncomfortable, nodded quickly. We'll be going. Judge. He and his men mounted up and rode away. Their departure hurried. Morgan didn't move. He stood on the porch, in the freezing cold, holding her while she shuddered and wept, until the last of the sobs quieted into ragged, hitching breaths. He held her, and something silent passed between them. He was no longer her judge. She was no longer his prisoner. They were just two people, standing in the ruins. Later that day, the cabin was quiet. Clara moved through a fog, but she moved. She found herself in the pantry. She saw a small sack of dried apples and a jar of cinnamon. She pulled them down. She made a pie. She hadn't made a pie in years. She worked the dough, her hands sure, her mind blessedly blank. When Morgan came in from chopping wood, the cabin smelled of apples and cinnamon. It smelled like a home. He stamped the snow from his boots, his movements hesitant. He looked at the pie cooling on the table. He looked at her. She was by the fire, mending one of his shirts. She looked up. The grief was still there, a bruise on her heart, but the wildness was gone. She looked at the snow caked on the shoulder of his coat. She stood, walked over to him, and brushed it off. Her hand lingered for a second. A simple, domestic touch. He was staring at her, his face taut as if expecting another blow. Clara looked at him, at this broken, complicated man who had saved her life and wrecked it, all at once, and a small, weary but genuine smile touched the corners of her mouth. He just stared, his eyes wide. He looked as if he'd just seen the sun rise after a lifetime of darkness. The apple pie had changed the air in the cabin. It was a simple thing, baked in the cast-iron pan, but its scent of cinnamon and cooked fruit lingered for days, a phantom of domesticity. It was a flag of truce in their silent war. The week since her brother's death had fallen into a new pattern. It was a quiet, shared existence. Clara mended his clothes, and he no longer snatched them from her as a prisoner, but handed them over as a man in need of a service. She cooked meals, and he ate them, and sometimes he would even meet her eye across the small table and nod, a small, curt gesture of thanks that felt louder than a shouted compliment. But the world outside the ridgeline had not forgotten them. The silence of the snow was a lie. The town of Laramie Creek was a buzzing hive of speculation. The first sign came with one of Morgan's own ranch hands, a young man named Silas, who was paid to check on the homestead once a month. He arrived leading a mule packed with supplies. He stopped his horse a good 20 yards from the cabin, his face stiff and uncomfortable. "Judge Thorne!" he shouted, not dismounting. Morgan stepped onto the porch. Clara watched from the crack in the door. "Left the flour and the beans," Silas said, nodding to the mule. He wouldn't look at the cabin. "Mister, Croft sends his regards, and he says the town's talkin'." "What talk?" Morgan's voice was a low growl. "A promise of winter." Silas swallowed, his gaze darting to the cabin door. He saw Clara's shadow. "Just talk, Judge. They say the month is almost up. They're wonderin' if you're keepin' her." His eyes were a mix of morbid curiosity and judgment. "Folks are saying it's a sin, that you've taken a murderer's sister to your bed, to Elspeth's bed." Morgan's body went rigid. He took one step off the porch. "Get off my land, Silas." "I'm just telling you what's said." "And I'm telling you to get off my land. Leave the mule. I'll send it back when I'm ready." Silas, seeing the look on Morgan's face, didn't argue. He dismounted, tied the mule's lead to the porch rail, and got back on his own horse, riding away fast. Morgan's rage was a terrible, cold thing. He unloaded the supplies in a violent, jerky silence. That night, Clara felt the chill return. The town was not a distant memory. It was a breathing monster, waiting at the foot of the ridge. A few days later, Morgan rode to town himself. He said he needed to file papers at the land office, but Clara knew he was going to face the whispers. He was gone for most of the day. The silence of the cabin was absolute. Clara found herself restless, pacing the small space. She went out to the woodpile, her shawl pulled tight, pinned to the rough bark of the cabin wall. Near the door was a piece of dirty canvas. It had been left by Silas, or some other rider. On it, scrawled in charcoal, was one word: whore. Clara stared at it. The single word, a physical blow. It was what they thought of her. Not a survivor, not a woman grieving, but a thing to be used and discarded. A sinner. The shame she had fought to keep at bay washed over her, hot and acidic. She tore the canvas from the wall, her hands trembling, and threw it into the fire. When Morgan returned, his face was a mask of thunder. He had ridden his horse hard. He didn't say a word about what had happened in town, what had been said to him, but he saw her face, the redness around her eyes, the way she flinched when he shut the door. That night, as they sat by the fire, the tension was a wire, pulled taut. "My month is over," Clara said, her voice small, her gaze fixed on the flames. "In 2 days." He did not move. He was staring at her, his profile hard in the firelight. I should leave," she continued, her voice trembling, though she tried to keep it steady. "The snow it's clear enough. I can walk to town, find work, maybe at the hotel, or I can move on, to Cheyenne." He said nothing. "It's what everyone expects," she whispered. It's the sentence. I served it. I'm free." Morgan was silent. He just watched her, and the look in his eyes was something she had never seen. It was not anger. It was not judgment. It was the raw, open, terrified look of a man watching his own life fall from a cliff. It was a look of such profound loss that Clara's breath caught in her throat. He stood up, his chair scraping violently on the floor. He grabbed his coat and stormed out of the cabin, leaving her alone with the echo of her own words. He did not come back for hours. When he did, he smelled of the cold night air and a faint trace of whiskey. He rolled himself in the blanket on the floor, his back to her, and the chasm between them felt as wide as the territory. 2 days later, the day her sentence was officially over, a wagon appeared. It was not the sheriff. It was a black, sturdy wagon, and it was driven by a woman. The woman was tall, dressed in severe black wool, her face framed by a bonnet. She looked as unyielding as the landscape. She stopped the wagon, climbed down with a stiff, righteous energy, and marched to the cabin door. She did not knock. She opened it. Morgan, who had been cleaning his rifle, looked up, his face darkening. "Agnes," he said, his voice flat. "Morgan Thorne." The woman's voice was deep, resonant. Used to filling a church, she was Mrs. Agnes Reed, the widow of the territory's last circuit preacher. She was the town's conscience. Her eyes, the color of slate, scanned the cabin, taking in the mended shirt on the chair, the smell of baking bread, and landed on Clara, who stood by the stove, her heart a cold knot. Agnes's face, which was already severe, hardened into a mask of pure disgust. "So it is true," she said, her voice dripping with judgment. She advanced into the room, ignoring Clara as if she were a piece of furniture. She spoke only to Morgan. "Have you lost your mind? Have you no shame? Has your grief finally curdled your soul?" "This is my home, Agnes," Morgan said, standing slowly. "This was Elspeth's home," she boomed, pointing a gloved finger. "A good, decent, God-fearing woman, and you have brought this strumpet into her bed. A criminal, the sister of a murderer." "She is not," Morgan began. "Do not defend her," Agnes cried, her eyes flashing. She turned her full, venomous attention on Clara. You think you can come here with your witch's ways? You prey on a good man's grief. You bewitch him, slide into his home, into his life. You are a poison girl, a Jezebel. You are shaming the memory of a woman you are not fit to speak of." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Every word was a nail. This was the voice of the town, the voice of decency, the voice of God himself, telling her what she was. A whore, a witch. She saw her entire wretched future in Agnes's eyes, a life of being pointed at, whispered about, cast out. Shame, so profound it stole her breath, made her want to disappear. She grabbed her thin shawl from the peg. Her hands were shaking. She would walk out. She would walk into the snow. She would go anywhere. She could not, would not, stand here and be this thing. She took a step toward the door. "Stop!" The word was not from Agnes. It was from Morgan. It was spoken so quietly it barely carried, but it was a command of such absolute authority that both women froze. He stepped forward, placing himself between Clara and the widow. He was taller than Agnes, broader. He physically eclipsed her. He looked down at the widow, and the cold fury in his eyes made even Agnes Reed take an involuntary step back. "Agnes," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You were Elspeth's friend. You held her hand when she was sick. For the memory of that kindness, and that alone, you get to leave my property standing." Agnes's jaw dropped. "Morgan, I am here to save your soul." "My soul is my own affair," he snapped. "This woman," he turned, just slightly, to gesture toward Clara, but he did not look at her, "is under my protection. Her name," he said, the words clear and deliberate, "is Clara Emerson. You will not speak of her, or to her, in that manner again. Not in my home, not in the street, not in your prayers." He pointed to the door. "Get out!" You would cast me out for her?" Agnes sputtered, her righteous indignation turning to disbelief. "I am casting you out for trespassing on my land and on my patience. Go home, Agnes." "Egg." "Now," he roared. The word was an explosion. Agnes Reed flinched as if he had struck her. Her face, a moment ago so full of judgment, was now pale with shock and a little fear. She gathered the tattered shreds of her dignity, pulled her shawl tight, and marched out of the cabin, her back rigid. She climbed into her wagon and, with a furious snap of the reins, turned the horse and left. The silence she left behind was deafening. Clara was standing by the door, her shawl clutched in her hand. She was trembling. He had defended her. He had named her. He had cast out the town's conscience for her. She looked at him. He was still staring at the door, his chest rising and falling, his hands clenched at his sides. He looked undone. He turned to her, his eyes still turbulent. He looked at the shawl in her hand. "Where were you going?" I don't know," she whispered. "Away." "There is nowhere to go," he said. It was not a threat. It was a simple, brutal statement of fact. That night, the wall of ice between them was gone, melted by the fire of the day's confrontation. The cabin felt small again, but not like a prison. It felt like a fortress for two. He did not go to the floor. He sat in his chair, staring into the fire. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, her hands in her lap. "She was wrong," Clara said softly. Morgan looked up. "I know." "No," Clara said, meeting his gaze. "I mean, about me, what I am, but she was also right. About Elspeth. This is her home. I shouldn't be here." Morgan stood and walked to her. He knelt in front of her, just as he had when he bandaged her hand. He took her hands, his grip firm. "Elspeth is gone. Clara," he said, his voice rough. "This is a house of ghosts. Until you—" He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, and the raw need she saw there was no longer just about grief or loneliness. It was about her. She started, but she had no words. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not the desperate, bruising kiss of their first passion. It was not the hesitant, yearning kiss by the fire. This was something new. It was slow. It was gentle. It was a question. She answered him. Her hands, which had been passive in his, moved. She brought one up to his face, her fingers tracing the hard line of his jaw. She kissed him back. It was a terrifyingly intimate thing. This was not a clash of two broken people. This was a slow, deliberate coming together. He lifted her from the bed's edge and carried her the few inches onto the mattress, laying her down as if she were made of spun glass. Their love-making was a revelation. It was slow. It was quiet. It was an exploration, a mapping of scars, both seen and unseen. It was the touch of a hand, not in passion, but in simple wonder. It was a look, held for a long moment, that said more than any vow. It was the first time, in that cabin, in that life, that either of them had felt truly safe. Later, she lay in his arms, her head on his chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart. The fire was low. The wind was quiet. She realized the truth with a sudden, startling clarity that made her heart stop and then restart with a painful lurch. It was not gratitude. It was not dependency. It was not the fear of the alternative. She loved this man, this broken, hard, silent, and fiercely protective man. The thought was more terrifying than Agnes Reed, more final than the gallows. To love him was to give him the power to destroy her, a power she had sworn she would never give to any man again. He was watching her. She could feel his gaze, even in the dim light. "They forced my hand," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. Clara lifted her head, confused. "What? Who?" "The town," he said. His gaze was distant, remembering the saloon. "Biddle, Harris, the whole council, the ones who lost their sons. I don't understand." "The hanging," he said, his voice flat. "They were set on it. They wanted it. Public. Fast. They said you were a symbol of the lawlessness. They wanted the town to see you afraid." He closed his eyes, a muscle in his jaw tightening. "I argued. I told them it was not justice, but they were a mob. They were a jury and a council, but they were a mob." "So what did you do?" she whispered. I gave them a different show, he said, his voice bitter. I proposed the sentence. Clara's blood ran cold. You? I had to give them something that looked like punishment, he said, turning to look at her, his eyes burning with an old, cold fury. Something that satisfied their need for cruelty, but kept you breathing. I told them I would humiliate you, that I would chain you, that I would make you my servant. I told them it was a fate worse than hanging. I gave them a villain to hate and a victim to pity. It was the only way. Clara was stunned. She was shaking. The cold ride, the chains, the public shame. It wasn't just his cruelty. It was a calculated, brutal performance, a shield. He had saved her. He had taken on the town's suspicion, their judgment, their whispers, all to keep her alive. She stared at him, the man she thought she knew, the judge, the captor, the lover, the savior. But why? She whispered, the question torn from her. Why do that for me? A stranger, a criminal. Morgan's gaze faltered. He looked away from her, up at the dark, log-beamed ceiling. She had asked the one question he could not answer. He couldn't tell her that when he saw her in that courtroom, her eyes full of fury and not a trace of fear. She had been the first thing that had made him feel alive in 3 years. He couldn't admit that saving her felt like he was, for the first time, atoning for not being able to save Elspeth. He couldn't admit that he needed her. It was the only way, he said again, his voice flat. The wall was back up. And Clara, hearing the finality in his tone, seeing him retreat back into his fortress, kept her own secret. She couldn't tell him that she didn't want to leave. She couldn't admit that the thought of walking away from this cabin, from him, was more terrifying than any storm. She had begged for a life once and lost everything. She would not beg for a home. The silence returned, but it was a new, agonizing stalemate. The decision was taken out of their hands by the sky. A new storm blew in, not with the sharp violence of the thunder, but with a suffocating, blinding wall of white. It was a true blizzard, a howling, screaming force that erased the world. For 3 days, they were trapped. The cabin was a small, warm pocket in a world of roaring, frozen chaos. They moved around each other, 2 people on a life raft, the unspoken truth swirling around them like the snow outside. On the 4th day, the wind died. The silence was sudden and profound. The world was remade, buried in snow that was waist-deep. "We need more wood in the house," Morgan said, his voice dull. "I'll get it," Clara said, desperate for a breath of air that wasn't thick with their tension. She bundled herself in his heavy coat, the one that smelled of him. The porch was a landscape of drifts, but the steps were visible. She didn't see the patch of black ice beneath the powder of new snow. Her foot slipped. She went down, not with a gasp, but with a hard, sharp cry of pain as her hip and shoulder connected with the frozen wood. She landed in a heap at the bottom of the 3 steps. The cabin door flew open so fast it slammed against the log wall. Morgan stood there, his face as white as the snow. He saw her, crumpled, not moving, at the bottom of the steps. "Elspeth," he breathed, the name a choked, terrified prayer. He wasn't seeing Clara. He was seeing his wife, collapsed in the snow. He was seeing the blizzard, feeling the helplessness, the smoke, the cold, the death. The panic was absolute, a wild, visceral terror that wiped his mind clean. "No," he muttered, scrambling down the steps, his bad leg forgotten. "No, not again. I won't. I can't." He was not speaking to her. He was speaking to God, to the ghosts. He reached her, his hands frantic. Clara looked up, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock, both from the fall and from the terror on his face. "Morgan, I'm all right. I just slipped." He didn't hear her. He scooped her up in his arms, his grip iron, his entire body trembling. He carried her inside as if she weighed nothing, as if she were a fragile, priceless thing that was already broken. He kicked the door shut with his boot and carried her straight to the fire, setting her down in the chair with a gentleness that was almost violent in its intensity. He knelt before her, his hands shaking as they ran over her arms, her legs, his face a mask of raw, unfiltered panic. "Are you hurt? Did you hit your head? Clara, talk to me." Clara, her hip aching but her heart pounding from the look in his eyes, just stared at him. She had fallen, but he was the one who was broken. She saw it all, the depth of his fear, the rawness of his old wound, and the new, terrifying place she held within it. She saw, in his panic, how easily he could lose her, and how utterly, completely terrified he was of it. "I'm all right, Morgan," she said, her voice soft. She reached out, her hand shaking, and laid it on his cheek. "I'm here." He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch like a dying man, his body still shaking. His panic was a more profound confession than any words of love. Seeing her fall, he had not seen an accident. He had seen a repetition of his own personal hell. His terror laid him bare. He was a man who had lost everything to the ice, and she was the only warmth he had left. The storm that had trapped them became their world. The wind screamed, a constant, high-pitched wail that erased all other sound. Day and night. The snow piled up against the windows, sealing them in, turning the cabin into a cave lit only by the flickering orange of the fire and the steady, low glow of the whale oil lamp. The world shrank to the four-log walls, to the small circle of heat. They lived in this pocket of borrowed time. The days and nights blurred into one long, continuous moment. They spoke, but their words were soft, small things, swallowed by the roaring wind. They spoke of the land, of the way the snowdrifts formed, of the books on his shelf. They did not speak of the future. They did not speak of the town. They did not speak of her leaving. They existed. They ate. They slept. They fed the fire. The storm stripped away the last of their roles. Judge, prisoner, captor, captive. They were just a man and a woman, surviving. On the third night of the blizzard, the wind reached a fever pitch. It sounded as if the sky were being torn apart. They sat at the small table, the remnants of their supper, biscuits and dried apple stew, between them. The fire was roaring, but the cold still crept in. Clara looked at him. His face was worn, the lines around his eyes deeper in the lamplight. He was not looking at her. He was staring at the window, at the black glass that reflected the room, his gaze fixed on the ghost of the storm. He had been so careful since her fall, his movements around her hesitant, as if she were a piece of fine china he was afraid to break. He had not slept on the floor. He had taken his place in the bed, but he had kept to his own side, a rigid line of control, terrified to touch her, terrified not to. She rose from the table. He watched her, his body tensing. She did not go to her side of the bed. She walked to his chair, where he sat by the fire, and knelt before him, just as he had knelt before her. She took his hand. It was large, rough, calloused from the axe and the reins. She brought it to her cheek, closing her eyes, leaning into his warmth. A sound left his throat, a low, broken thing. He put his other hand in her hair, his fingers tangling in the soft strands, his grip desperate, as if he were holding on to an anchor. "Clara," he whispered, his voice thick. "It's all right," she said. This time, it was she who led him. This time, it was not a collision of grief and desperation. It was not a fever dream of buried need. It was slow, it was deep. In the big bed, with the wind screaming for its dead, they made love. It was a deliberate, searching act. It was a mapping of bodies, a learning of scars. His touch was not rough, it was reverent. His hands, which had judged and punished, now soothed. He moved with a glacial slowness, his eyes open, watching her face in the dim. red light from the fire. And she was not the frightened, defiant girl. She was a woman. She met his gaze. She touched his face, his shoulders, the old puckered scar on his leg. She claimed him, not with fire, but with a quiet, certain strength. It was an act of profound, terrifying intimacy, a silent vow made in a world that had only two people. Afterward, they lay tangled, their limbs heavy, their breathing synchronized. The cabin was blessedly warm. The storm was a distant, muffled roar. Clara lay with her head on his chest, her ear against the steady, solid drum of his heart. She felt safe. It was a feeling she had not known in years, perhaps ever. Safe, not just from the storm, or the town, but from the world. "Morgan," she whispered, her voice so soft it was almost part of the wind. "I'm here." She took a breath, summoning a courage she did not know she possessed. "When the snow clears, when I go back." She felt him stiffen, the steady rise and fall of his chest pausing for a single, terrible second. "I don't want to go," she admitted. The words were out, small and fragile, in the vast, roaring dark. I want to stay here with you." He did not answer. The silence stretched, filled only by the wind. She lifted her head, trying to see his face in the shadows. He had turned his head away from her, his gaze fixed on the log wall. A single muscle in his jaw worked, his throat tight. He was ashamed, not of her, not of what they had done. He was ashamed to hope. He was a man who had made a covenant with grief, who had built a life on the foundation of loss. Hope was a betrayal of that grief. It was a fragile, green shoot in a world of ice, and he was terrified that the slightest touch would kill it, and him along with it. To hope was to invite a pain he knew, with certainty. He could not survive a second time. Clara's heart ached. She had offered him her truth, and he could not take it. He was a man so broken, he could not accept the one thing that might heal him. She said nothing else. She lay her head back down on his chest, but the rhythm of his heart was different. It was faster, the beat of a man trapped. The storm broke 2 days later. The world outside was reborn, blindingly white, silent and deep. The sky was a sharp, aching blue. The new world was beautiful, and it was a promise of an ending. They did not speak of her admission again. The air in the cabin was thick with it, a fragile, unspoken thing that they both stepped around. A day later, they heard the sound of snowshoes. It was Sheriff Harris, his face raw from the wind, his breath pluming. He was not there for a social call. He carried a leather satchel. "Judge," he said, nodding, his eyes carefully avoiding Clara. "The town's been concerned. The council met." "About what, Harris?" Morgan's voice was flat, devoid of the life he had shared with her in the storm. "About the sentence. Judge, it's been over a month. By our count. Long over, with the blizzard." He reached into his satchel and pulled out a folded, official-looking paper. They want her back." "Back for what?" Morgan asked, his hand resting on the doorframe. "A formal release," Harris said, his voice uncomfortable. Agnes Reed has been talking. The council agrees. They want a public acknowledgement that the sentence is complete, that she's free to go." He cleared his throat. "They want to draw a line under it. Judge, make it clean." "Make it clean." Clara, standing by the fire, felt the words like a slap. They wanted to wash the sin of her presence, and his away. They wanted to return to the way things were. Morgan said nothing. He just stared at the sheriff. "She's to present herself to the council tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. They'll release her, formally." Harris pushed the paper toward Morgan. It's a summons. Judge, official. Morgan took the paper. He didn't look at it. He just kept his cold eyes on the sheriff. You came all this way, through this snow, to deliver that. They insisted. Morgan, I'm just the messenger. Harris shifted. I'll see you in town tomorrow. Then, ma'am. He gave Clara a quick, pitying glance and left, his snowshoes crunching away into the vast silence. Clara stared at the paper in Morgan's hand. It was over. Her time was done. The world had come to reclaim them. She began to prepare. What was there to prepare? She had nothing. She had arrived in chains, in a thin calico dress. She owned nothing but the mended clothes on her back, clothes that belonged to him. She washed the breakfast dishes. She swept the floor. She made the bed, smoothing the quilts with a hand that trembled. Each small, domestic act was a farewell. She was packing her memories, the scent of the apple pie, the heat of the fire, the weight of his gaze. Morgan watched her. He was a man of stone, his face an unreadable mask. He was standing by the large, rough-hewn chest at the foot of their bed, a chest she had never seen him open. He knelt, his bad legs stiff, and lifted the heavy lid. The scent of cedar and dried lavender filled the air. It was Elspeth's. He reached inside, his movements slow. He pulled out something heavy, made of dark, rich fur, almost black in the dim light. It was a coat, a woman's coat, lined with beaver fur, with a high collar and deep pockets. It was a coat made for this land, a coat of wealth and warmth. He stood. He held it out to her. The wind is sharp on the trail, he said, his voice a rasp. Clara stared at the coat. It was his wife's, the most intimate, precious thing he had, besides the journals. He was giving it to her. It was a gift of protection. It was a goodbye. Morgan, I can't, she whispered. It's hers. She would not want you to freeze, he said, his voice thick. It is just a coat, and you are not Elspeth. That was it. That was the acknowledgement. He saw her. He was giving her the coat not because she was a replacement, but because she was Clara, and she was leaving. Her throat was too tight to speak. She let him put the coat on her. It was heavy and impossibly warm, the fur soft against her chin. It enveloped her, smelling of cedar, and faintly, of him. She was ready. They walked to the head of the trail, the same trail he had dragged her up in chains. The snow was packed hard. The world was blindingly white. They stopped. The town was a thin plume of smoke in the valley below, a world away. He looked at her, bundled in his wife's coat. She looked at him, his face raw from the cold, his eyes a dark, bottomless pain. What was there to say? Thank you for saving my life. I'm sorry I'm leaving. I love you. Don't let me go. The words were all there, a screaming, silent crowd in the space between them. He reached out, his gloved hand, and just touched her cheek, a brief, cold, searing touch. She nodded. Once, she couldn't speak. She turned and began to walk. She did not run. She walked, each step a small death, down the trail, away from the cabin, away from him. She did not look back. She knew if she did, she would never leave. And she knew if she stayed, he would never ask her to. Back in town, Clara was free. The release was a cold, formal affair in the saloon. The same room where she had been sentenced. The counsel, 4 men in dark suits, sat behind the oak table. Agnes Reed was there, sitting in the front row, her face a mask of sour victory. Clara stood before them, wearing Morgan's coat. She felt like an imposter. The lead councilman read from the paper. Clara Emerson, you have served the sentence of 1 month's indenturement to Judge Thorne. As stipulated, you are, hereby, released from his custody and are free to conduct yourself as a free citizen of this territory. He did not look at her. He looked at the paper. It is done. It was done. She was free. She walked out of the saloon. The air felt thin, the sunlight weak. People on the street, the same people who had spat at her, now they looked at her differently. They nodded. Some of the women looked at her with a new, strange respect. The men, their eyes lingered, not with the leering curiosity of before, but with a kind of wary awe. She was not just the woman who had aided a murderer. She was the woman who had been given to Morgan Thorne. She had survived a month in that haunted cabin, with that broken, bitter man. She had survived the blizzard. She had walked back into town wearing his dead wife's coat. She was not a victim. She was a survivor. In the West, there was no higher rank. But Clara felt no joy in it. She felt empty. The town was loud. The smells of wet mud and cigar smoke were overwhelming. The voices were too sharp. After the profound silence of the ridge, the town was a jarring, painful noise. She realized, with a sickening lurch, that she had been changed. The land, the vast, cold, beautiful, and unforgiving land, had gotten into her blood. The man, the quiet, broken, and fiercely strong man, had, too. The quiet strength of surviving with him, the shared bread, the shared warmth. It had reforged her. She was no longer the girl who had been dragged in chains. She was a different creature, and she did not belong here. She got a room at the small hotel, paid for with the $20 she found in the pocket of the fur coat. Morgan, a final, silent provision. She heard the talk, in the general store, buying a comb, in the diner, eating a bowl of thin stew. They weren't just talking about her. They were talking about him. "Heard Biddle's brother is trying to force his hand," one man said to another, his voice low. "Thorne's land. The Biddles and the Crofts. They're forming a company. Want to buy him out." "He'll never sell," the other man said. "He might. Word is that land's tied up in his wife's name, too. They're saying his title ain't clear. They're pressuring him, threatening to take it to the territorial court." "That's his life, that land. He buried his family there." Clara's blood ran cold. They were trying to take his land. The land he had bled for, the land where his ghosts lived. Because of her, because he had defied them, defended her. Agnes Reed's words. The council's anger. This was their revenge. They were trying to run him out. A few days later, a man approached her. He was young, a rancher named Elijah Smith. She had known him, briefly, before. He had been kind, but he had, like all the others, turned his back when she was accused. "Clara," he said, taking off his hat. He was handsome, in a simple, clean-cut way. It's good to see you. Back in town. Looking, well." She just looked at him, her gaze flat. She was wearing a simple gray dress she had bought, but she still had Morgan's coat. She never took it off. I was wondering," he said, flushing. Now that you're free, I'm looking for a wife. Clara, my homestead it's a good one. You'd be respected." She remembered. She remembered begging for a man's life. She remembered offering herself up. A sacrifice that was not only taken, but ignored. She looked at Elijah Smith, at his simple, honest, and utterly weak face. He was offering her respect. "No," she said. Her voice was not angry. It was not sad. It was just cold. As cold as the wind off the peaks. He flinched. "Oh, well, I just thought—" "No," she said again. She turned and walked away, leaving him standing in the mud. She needed to work. She couldn't live on Morgan's $20 forever. She went to the small, one-room schoolhouse. The teacher, an elderly woman, was leaving, her lungs too weak for the Wyoming winters. Clara, who had been schooled by her mother, who could read and write and cipher, applied. The school board, the same men who had released her, looked at her. They saw the fur coat. They saw the cold, steady gaze. They saw a woman who had survived Morgan Thorne. They hired her. She began to teach. The children, at first wary, came to respect her. She was firm. She was quiet. She was kind. In a distant way, she moved into the small room at the back of the schoolhouse. She built a life of chalk dust and spelling books, and the sound of children's voices. It was a good life. It was a safe life. It was a free life. And every night, when the children were gone, when the stove was banked, she would stand at the small window. She would wrap Elspeth's coat around her shoulders, and she would stare. She would stare past the rooftops of the town, past the dark plains, to the jagged black line of the mountains, to the one single lonely ridge where she had never been free, and where she had, for one brief, stormy moment, belonged. The weeks that followed Clara's departure were a special kind of hell for Morgan Thorne. The cabin was not just empty, it was dead. The silence, once his only companion, was now an accusing, hollow thing. It was filled with the phantom scent of apples and cinnamon, the ghost of her laughter, the memory of her head on his chest. He would wake in the night, his hand reaching for her, and find only the cold, empty sheets. His grief was a living, breathing monster. He had lost one wife to the cold, and he had, with his own stubborn, terrified pride, driven the other one away. He had been given a second chance, a fragile, impossible thing, and he had turned his face from it, ashamed to hope. Now, hope was gone, and the shame was all that remained. The town did not let him grieve in peace. The Biddle and Croft families, emboldened by the council's support and Agnes Reed's righteous fury, made their move. They challenged his title to the northern pasture, the one with the stream. They claimed, through a twist of old territorial law, that Elspeth's death had muddled the deed. They were trying to strangle his ranch, to take his water. They were punishing him for choosing Clara, for defying them. He received letters. He received threats. He ignored them, his heart a cold stone. He was a man with nothing left to lose. He was mending a harness on his porch, the late afternoon sun a weak, watery thing. When he saw the rider, it was the young man who ran the mail route, and he was leading a pack mule. "Judge Thorne," the young man called out, his voice wary. Morgan had not been a pleasant neighbor these past weeks. "What is it?" Morgan's voice was a rasp. "Got a parcel for you. From town." The man unstrapped a small, square package, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. He handed it to Morgan and, not waiting for a reply, turned his mule and rode off, eager to be away. Morgan stared at the package. It was light. He took it inside, his hands, for the first time in weeks, unsteady. He set it on the table where he had first kissed her. He cut the twine with his knife. He unfolded the paper. Inside, there was a scarf. It was a simple thing, made of blue wool, one she had worn almost every day. It was not his, it was hers. It had been in her small bundle of possessions when she was first brought to him. He lifted it, and he smelled her, the faint, clean scent of lye soap, and woman, and wood smoke. It was her, a physical, tangible ghost. A piece of paper fell from its folds. A note. He picked it up, her handwriting. Not the delicate, looping script of his wife, but a strong, clear, steady hand, the hand of a schoolteacher. It was not a long note. He read it once. He read it a second time. His heart, which he had thought was dead, lurching in his chest like a dying animal. "You said I was only yours for a month, but you never said what would happen if I wanted more. He closed his eyes. The note, the scarf. It was not a question. It was a confession. It was the hope he had been too cowardly to claim. She had not begged. She had stated a fact. And now, the choice was his. He was a man who had been buried alive for 3 years. He had been given a single, flickering candle, and he had let it go out. Now, she had just struck a match in the darkness. He did not hesitate. He did not think. He moved. He strode out of the cabin, the scarf still clutched in his hand. He did not bother with a coat. He saddled his horse, his movements economical and violent. He yanked the cinch so tight the horse grunted. He swung into the saddle, his bad leg a distant, forgotten ache. He rode down the ridge, not with the careful pace of a man preserving his mount, but with the reckless, thundering abandon of a man running to a fire, not from one. He took the trail at a dangerous gallop, snow and mud flying from his horse's hooves. He was a force of nature, a blizzard of pure, terrified, furious need. He hit the main street of Laramie Creek like a cannonball. People scattered. He heard shouts. He didn't care. He knew where she was. He rode the horse directly to the schoolhouse, the animal's sides heaving, and reined it in so hard it reared. He didn't tether it. He swung down from the saddle and stormed the building. He kicked the door open. It slammed against the wall, the sound echoing like a gunshot. The room went silent. 20 small faces, children of the ranchers and shopkeepers who had condemned him, stared at him, their mouths open. And there she was. She was standing at the front, a piece of chalk in her hand, a word half written on the blackboard. She was wearing a simple gray dress, her hair pulled back in a neat, severe bun. She looked respectable. She looked small. She looked like a stranger. When she saw him, her face went white, not with fear, not with love, with pure, unadulterated fury. "Morgan!" she hissed. "Clara," he said. He took a step into the room. "Get out!" she said, her voice low and shaking. For her ears and his only, "Get out! Right now!" He took another step. He saw the children, staring. He saw the world she had built, the safe, quiet, respectable world. You cannot be here," she said, her voice rising, the color flooding back into her face in 2 bright, angry spots. "You have no right. This is my life. You have no right to come in here and—" "Clara," he said again, his voice raw. He held up his hand. The blue scarf dangled from his fingers. Her eyes fixed on it, her composure, the one she had built with chalk dust and spelling books, shattered. "How dare you?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a rage that shook her entire body. She walked toward him, away from the children, her hands clenched. "How dare you come here? How dare you shame me? Again, in front of everyone. You think you can just ride in, kick down my door. And what?" He had no words. He had only this one, desperate, animal need. "Wasn't it enough?" She was crying now, tears of pure, hot rage. "Wasn't it enough to drag me through the mud, to make me your property? You had to come here, to the one place I have, the one place I have earned, and ruin that, too. You are a selfish, cruel man. Morgan Thorne, and I... "Clara," he said, one last time. He grabbed her. He pulled her to him, his hands hard on her upper arms. He ignored the gasps of the children. He ignored her struggles. He bent his head, his face inches from hers, his eyes blazing into hers. "Clara," he whispered, and her name was a prayer, a confession, and a plea. Her fury broke. It did not fade, it shattered. The rage, the shame, the carefully built walls, they all turned to dust. She saw him, not the judge, not the monster. She saw the man who had knelt by her bed, who had held her in the storm, whose eyes were a mirror of her own brokenness. A sob, a great, tearing sound, ripped from her throat. She sagged against him, her fight gone, her face buried in his shirt. You weren't supposed to come," she wept. "You were supposed to let me go." "I can't," he whispered, his arms wrapping around her, holding her up. His own body was shaking. "I tried. God help me, Clara, I can't." He held her there, in the middle of the schoolhouse, while 20 children watched. He held her, and he knew he would never let her go again. "Marry me," he said, his voice a rough command against her hair. She pulled back, her face stained with tears, her eyes wide with shock. "What? Marry me. Now. Today." "Morgan, you can't," she stammered, looking around at the wide-eyed children. "At the open door. At the town just outside. They hate us." "I don't care," he said. It was the truest thing he had ever said. He looked over her head, at the small, terrified faces. "Go home," he boomed. "Go home. School is done for today." The children, needing no other invitation, grabbed their coats and fled, streaming out the door, eager to spread the news. Within 5 minutes, the street outside the schoolhouse was filling. Agnes Reed was there, her face a mask of thunder. The Biddle brothers were there, their expressions murderous. Sheriff Harris was there, his face weary. The whole town was gathering. Morgan Thorne, his arm securely around Clara's waist, led her out onto the schoolhouse steps. He stood, facing them all, his gaze sweeping over them, cold and hard. He was the judge again, but he was more. "Listen to me," he shouted, his voice carrying in the cold, clear air. You've had your talk, you've had your say, you passed your judgment, and I passed mine. Now, it is done." He turned to Clara, ignoring the mutters from the crowd. He spoke, his voice still loud, for all to hear. "I asked you to marry me, Clara Emerson." She was trembling, but her eyes, fixed on his, were steady. "It is not a proposal," he said, and his voice softened. "Just for her. It is a fact. You are not my prisoner. You are not my servant. You are the woman I am going to marry." Clara looked from his face, so full of raw, terrifying certainty, to the crowd. She saw Agnes Reed's hatred. She saw the whispers. She saw a lifetime of being an outcast. And then she looked back at Morgan. She saw the man who had ridden through a blizzard of public opinion to get to her. She saw the man who was willing to stand in front of the world and claim her. She saw the man she loved. She lifted her chin. She put her hand on his chest, over his heart. "Yes," she said. The word was quiet, but it was absolute. "No," Agnes Reed shrieked. "This is a mockery, a sin." Morgan Thorne turned his head, his eyes 2 chips of ice. "Be silent, Agnes, or I will silence you." He turned to Sheriff Harris. "We need a preacher." "Judge," Harris sighed. "I don't know." "You will find one," Morgan commanded, "or I will find one myself." Their wedding was modest. It was an hour later. The preacher, a terrified young man from the next county over, was found. The ceremony was held on the steps of the land office, as the church had suddenly, mysteriously, locked its doors. The town watched, some disapproved, their arms crossed, their faces sour. Agnes Reed prayed, loudly, for their souls. The Biddle brothers watched, their eyes promising a different kind of retribution. But others watched with a different expression. The women who had seen her in the coat, the men who respected a man who took what he wanted. They watched with a grudging, silent respect. Morgan did not care. He stood, his gaze fixed only on Clara. She wore no veil. She wore her gray wool teaching dress. She had not had time to change. But as they stood before the preacher, Morgan reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small, simple, blue ribbon. I bought this," he said, his voice thick, "for your hair." His hands, so large and rough, trembled as he tied the ribbon in her hair. It was not a crown, it was not a veil, it was a promise. They said the words. Their voices were low, but steady. In the cold air, when the preacher said, "You may kiss the bride," Morgan did not hesitate. He pulled her to him and kissed her, a deep, public, possessive kiss that was not for the town, but for her. It was a sealing of the deal, a brand. When he lifted his head, he looked at the crowd. "She is Mrs. Thorne," he announced. "My wife." He led her to his horse. He swung up into the saddle and, reaching down, pulled her up behind him. He wrapped one arm around her waist, holding her tight. She wrapped her arms around his chest, resting her head on his back. He turned the horse, and, without looking back, they rode out of town, up the ridge, together. They returned to the homestead, but it was not the same place. It was not his tomb. It was not her prison. It was their home. They built it together. The winter was hard, but they had each other. The spring came, and the blessed thaw. Morgan, with the Biddle and Croft lawsuit still hanging over his head, did not fight them with paper. He fought them with work. He and Clara repaired the walls of the cabin, chinking the logs with fresh mud and straw. He rebuilt the section of the roof that had been damaged. He mended the fences. And Clara made it a home. She planted seeds in the frozen earth beside the graves of his wife and child. She built a small, protected garden. She laid flowers on Elspeth's grave, a simple, quiet gesture of peace. She was not replacing the dead. She was honoring them by choosing to live. They worked, side by side, from sunup to sundown. They grew to know each other in the long, quiet days. They learned the language of shared labor, of a hand passed, a tool given, a shared look over a long, hard task. They bought a milk cow. Clara churned butter. She baked bread that filled the cabin with a scent of real, lasting warmth. They created warmth from ruin. The land dispute, after a long, bitter fight, was finally settled. Morgan, with Clara at his side in the courtroom, proved his title. The Biddles and the Crofts, defeated, retreated. Winter came again. A year had passed. The final scene. The snow was falling, thick and soft, piling up against the windows. But this time, it was not a threat. It was a blanket. The cabin was warm, the fire blazing in the hearth. The shelves were full. A new, colorful quilt, one Clara had stitched herself, was on the bed. Clara was not in a chair. She was not on the floor. She was sitting in Morgan's lap, in the big chair by the fire. Her head was resting on his chest, her ear over his heart, listening to the slow, steady beat. He had one arm wrapped around her, his hand resting in her hair, the blue ribbon long since replaced by others. They watched the snow fall in a long, comfortable silence. He leaned his head down, his lips brushing her hair. "I was never meant to be loved," he whispered, his voice a low, rough thing, a confession he could only make in the dark. "I was a vessel for grief. I was as cold as the ground." He paused, his chest rising and falling beneath her cheek. "But you, Clara, you proved me wrong." She lifted her head, tilting it back to look at him. His face, in the firelight, was no longer the mask of a bitter judge. It was just a man's face, her man's face. The lines were still there, the scars, but they were softened by the warmth, by the love. She smiled, a slow, quiet smile that reached her eyes. "You punished me with love, Morgan Thorne." She replied, her voice soft but sure, "And I never want to be free of it again. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We would love to hear from you. Please comment and let us know where in the world you are listening from. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to From Wild West for more stories like this one. And finally, we truly value your thoughts, so please share them with us in English. We look forward to reading your comments.